The dust settled on her like a second skin, a fine grit that filled the creases of her eyelids and the cracks in her lips. It was the color of forgotten things. The sun beat down on the crown of her head, a relentless hammer striking the same nail over and over, and the rope at her wrists had worn through the fragile layer of her skin hours ago. It no longer burned. It was a dull, settled ache, a part of her now like a bone. She was tied to a hitching post in the center of what passed for a town square. A trough of brackish water stood nearby for the horses. Flies, fat and lazy, crawled from the water's scummed surface to the raw weeping at her wrists. She did not flinch. She had learned the economy of movement. To flinch was to spend energy she did not have. The townspeople of Jericho Flats drifted past. Some stared, their eyes lingering on the placard hung around her neck. The letters were crude, tar-black on splintered pine. For sale. Cheap. Others looked away too quickly, their gazes sliding off her as if she were made of glass reflecting a sun too bright to bear. A woman in a gray calico dress, clutching a basket of dried beans, met her eyes for a half-second. In that glance was a universe of pity and fear, but it closed just as fast, a shutter pulled down against a coming storm. Then she was gone, swallowed by the river of dusty indifference. A group of men leaned against the general store's veranda, their laughter a rough, bud thing that scraped the air. One of them, a heavy man named Brant with a florid face and eyes like two chips of slate, was the one who had tied her here. He had bought her contract, he said, from a man farther east. He had brought her here and found her wanting. Not strong enough for the field, not pretty enough for the house. His words had been loud, for the benefit of the whole town. Now he gestured toward her with a half-empty bottle, his ownership a casual, brutal thing. She was a piece of failed equipment left out in the sun to rust. She kept her gaze fixed on a single warped board in the walkway across the square. She counted the knots in the wood. 1, 2, 3. They looked like closed eyes. She focused on them, made them her world. A small, splintered country where she could retreat. She did not hear the individual words anymore, only the drone of voices, the stamp of a horse, the ceaseless whisper of the wind carrying the dust. The world had shrunk to the heat, the rope, and 3 knots in a weathered plank. Then, a shadow fell over her. It was different from the others. It was long and still. It did not move on. It stayed, a cool patch of absence in the day's oppressive glare. For a long time she did not look up. Looking up was a risk. Hope was a risk. But the shadow did not leave. It was a patient, quiet thing. Finally, slowly, she lifted her head. He stood with the sun at his back, a silhouette of a man, making his features impossible to see. He was not one of the town loafers. His clothes, though worn, were clean. A duster the color of the dirt road hung from his broad shoulders. He was lean, built of the same hard, unyielding material as the land itself. He held no bottle, offered no jeer. He just looked. His gaze was not hungry or cruel or even pitiful. It was steady like a surveyor measuring a tract of land, taking in the whole of it, the flaws and the damage and the boundaries. He carried whole winters in his eyes. His name was Elias, though she did not know it then. He was a rancher from the high plains, a man who came to town only when necessity bit him. His own loss was a shadow he wore, a companion that walked beside him. He saw the girl, thin as a fence rail, and saw not the placard, not the property, but the way she held her stillness. It was a stillness he recognized. It was the quiet of a place after a fire has swept through, leaving behind only ash and the memory of heat. Brant swaggered over, his boots kicking up clouds of ochre dust. "See something you like, Elias? Bit used, but she's got a strong back. Or she would, if she'd eat," he laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound. Elias did not look at Brant. His eyes remained on the girl. He saw the way her fingers were curled into loose fists, the knuckles white beneath the grime. He saw the tremor she fought to hide in her jaw. He reached into the pocket of his duster, his movements slow, deliberate. He pulled out a small leather pouch. The sound of coins shifting against each other was unnaturally loud in the waiting silence. "How much?" Elias's voice was low, a rumble that sounded like it came from under floorboards. It was a voice unused to speaking. Brant's eyes widened, a flicker of avarice in their stony depths. He had not expected a buyer, only humiliation for the girl and a show of his own soured power. He named a price. It was too high for a creature so broken. It was an insult. Elias didn't bargain. He untied the pouch and tipped a collection of coins into his palm. He counted them out, his motions precise, and dropped them into Brant's outstretched hand. The transaction was stark, stripped of all ceremony. It was the purchase of a shovel or a sack of flour. He walked past Brant then to the hitching post. He pulled a small, worn knife from his belt. The blade was clean. He did not speak to her, did not ask permission. He simply slid the blade between the rough hemp and her chafed skin and sawed through the ropes. The fibers parted with a dry sigh. Her hands fell to her sides, numb and useless. He stepped back, giving her space, a small island of it in the vast, watching square. He gestured with his head toward a wagon hitched near the mercantile, its bed empty save for a few burlap sacks. "Come on," it was not a question. She looked from his face, still shadowed, to the wagon, then back to the staring town. She took a step, her legs unsteady beneath her. She did not look back at Brant, who stood counting his coins, a bewildered sneer on his face. She walked past the trough and the flies, past the men on the veranda who had fallen silent, past the woman with the basket of beans who now watched with an unreadable expression. She walked toward the man and his wagon, leaving the placard lying in the dust. The journey had already begun. The ride out of Jericho Flats was a silent affair. The wagon wheels groaned in the deep ruts of the road, and the dust lifted behind them like pale ghosts trying to follow. She sat on the hard wagon bed, her back pressed against the side, her newly freed hands lying limp in her lap. The blood was beginning to return to them, a painful tingling, a pins and needles resurrection. Elias sat on the driver's bench, his back straight, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the land met the enormous, empty sky. He did not speak, did not look at her. The silence between them was not awkward. It was vast and elemental, like the landscape they moved through. It was a silence that had weight. After an hour, when the last specks of the town were long swallowed by the plains, he reached down beside him and picked up a canteen. He held it out behind him, not turning his head. His knuckles were raw and cracked from work, the skin pulled tight over the bones. She stared at the canteen for a long moment before reaching for it. Her fingers fumbled with the cap. The water was lukewarm and tasted of metal, but it was the first clean thing that had passed her lips in days. She drank slowly, deliberately, then screwed the cap back on and held it out. He took it without a word and placed it back by his side. It was the first kindness. It was a language she understood better than words. They traveled for the rest of the day. The sun arced across the sky, and the shadows of the wagon and the horses stretched long and thin, like ink spills on the parched earth. The land grew rougher, rising into low, rolling hills dotted with stubborn, wind-twisted juniper. The wind was a constant presence, a scouring hand that pushed against them. As dusk began to bleed purple and blood orange into the western sky, a shape emerged from the landscape. It was a house, small and low-slung, built of weathered timber that had gone gray as old bone. A barn stood nearby, its roof sagging slightly in the middle. A single, thin ribbon of smoke rose from a stone chimney, a fragile thread stitching the house to the sky. It was a place of profound isolation. He pulled the wagon to a stop near a paddock fence. The silence that fell when the wheels stopped turning was immense. Only the wind murmured, carrying the scent of dust and dry grass and something else, the faint, clean smell of wood smoke. "We're here," he said, his voice sounding rusty in the quiet. He swung down from the bench, his movements economical and sure. He did not offer her a hand. He unhitched the horses, his actions practiced and fluid, a ritual performed 1,000 times. She slid from the wagon bed, her bare feet landing softly in the cool dust. The ground was solid under her, a strange and welcome feeling. The house was as spare and quiet on the inside as it was on the out. A main room held a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a few shelves holding tins and jars. The air smelled of ash, old wood, and a faint, lingering sorrow. It was a house that had held its breath for a long time. There were no curtains on the windows, no pictures on the walls, no softness anywhere. It was a place for survival, not for living. Elias lit a lantern, and the soft yellow light pushed the shadows into the corners. He gestured toward the table. "Sit. There's stew." A pot sat on the hearth, kept warm by the embers. He ladled a portion into a wooden bowl and set it before her, along with a thick slice of dark bread and a spoon. He did the same for himself and sat opposite her. She looked at the food. It was simple venison and root vegetables, but it was hot and it was hers. She picked up the spoon, her hand trembling slightly. She ate slowly, her eyes on the bowl. He ate with the same quiet focus. The only sounds the scrape of spoons against wood and the crackle of the fire. He now fed with a fresh log. When they were finished, he took the bowls to a wash basin. He did not look at her as he spoke. "That room there is yours." He nodded toward a closed door. "Sleep. The bolt is on the inside. I don't lock doors in this house." She looked at the door, then back at him. It was an offering of safety, an unspoken contract. "You are not a prisoner here." She rose and went to the room. It was small, containing only a narrow cot with a folded blanket and a small, high window. The air was cold, still. It felt like a room that had not been used in a very long time. She ran her hand over the rough wool of the blanket. She slid the bolt on the door. It made a solid, heavy sound in the deep quiet of the house. It was the first door she had been able to lock for herself in more than a year. She lay down on the cot, fully clothed, and pulled the blanket over her. For the first time, she did not fear the coming of the night. The days settled into a rhythm, marked by the rising and setting of the sun. There were no orders given, no commands. Life was a series of tasks that needed doing, and they did them. She woke to the sound of him moving about the main room, stoking the fire. By the time she emerged from her room, he would be gone to the barn, leaving a pot of coffee warming on the hearth and a piece of bread on the table. She learned the shape of his life through the chores he left undone. A pile of mending, his work shirt torn at the elbow. A floor that needed sweeping. A garden patch choked with weeds. She began to fill in the empty spaces. She swept the floor, the broom whispering across the planks. She took his torn shirt and, using a needle and thread she found in a dusty tin, stitched the fabric together. Her stitches were small and neat, a line of careful discipline on the coarse cloth. When he returned for his midday meal, he would see the swept floor, the mended shirt laid on his chair. He would nod, a barely perceptible dip of his chin, and that was all. He worked from sunup to sundown, his presence a constant, steady force on the land around the house. She watched him from the window as she kneaded dough for bread, his solitary figure moving against the vast backdrop of the plains, mending a fence line that seemed to stretch to the edge of the world. He moved with a kind of grim purpose, as if work was the only thing holding him together. One afternoon, while weeding the struggling vegetable garden, her fingers brushed against a small, smooth stone at the base of a wild rose bush. She looked up and saw it was a marker. A single name was carved into it, the letters softened by wind and rain. Anna. Beside it, a smaller stone, unmarked. A wife. A child. The sorrow in the house now had a name. She understood the deep quiet of the place, the reason the second bedroom door was always closed. It was not empty. It was full of absence. She pulled a single, stubborn wildflower from the weeds and laid it on the stone. She did not know if he ever saw it. She began to cook. At first, it was just heating the stews he prepared. Then she started taking the lead. She found potatoes and onions in the root cellar, flour in a bin. She baked bread. The first loaf was a disaster, dense and hard as a river stone. When he came in for dinner, he broke a piece off, chewed it thoughtfully, and said nothing. She felt a flush of shame, a familiar heat behind her eyes. The silence stretched. "That loaf died in vain," he said finally, his expression unreadable in the firelight. She stared at him, unsure if it was a criticism or something else. A faint crinkle appeared at the corners of his eyes. "A little dry," she mumbled, her voice thin from disuse. "You didn't complain about mine," he countered, his own voice low. It was the closest they had come to a conversation. It was a tiny, fragile bridge built across the silence. The next day, her bread was better. He ate 2 slices. Her world began to expand from the knots in the wood to the 4 walls of the house, then to the garden, the chicken coop, the clothesline where she hung their washed things to flap and dance in the relentless wind. The land was hard and unforgiving, but it was honest. The wind didn't pretend to be gentle. The sun didn't pretend to be cool. She found a strange comfort in that. He, in turn, began to leave small things for her. A bucket of fresh milk from their 1 cow on the back step in the morning. A handful of late-season wild berries on the table. One evening, as a cold front moved in and the wind turned mean, he came in from the barn and laid a heavy wool shawl on the back of her chair. It was old and smelled of cedar. It was not his. It must have been Anna's. She wrapped it around her shoulders. It was warm. It was an acknowledgement. "I see you are cold." The nights were the hardest. The silence of the plains was so deep it felt like a pressure against the eardrums. Sometimes the past would come for her in her sleep. Not the town square, but what came before. The cramped spaces, the scent of fear, the sound of a key turning in a lock. She would wake with a gasp, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, the thin blanket clutched in her fists. One night, a nightmare worse than the others ripped a cry from her throat. She sat bolt upright, shaking, her breath coming in ragged sobs. The bolt on her door was a comfort, but the room felt like a cage. She scrambled out of the cot, her hands shaking so badly she could barely draw the bolt back. She stumbled into the main room. A single ember glowed in the fireplace, a lone red eye in the darkness. Elias was sitting in his chair, a silhouette against the dying light. He hadn't been sleeping. He was just sitting, watching the fire die. He looked up as she entered, his face all shadow. He didn't seem surprised to see her. "Don't," she whispered, the word raw in her throat. "Don't lock me in." It was a plea torn from the deepest part of her. He was silent for a long moment, the space between them filled with her ragged breathing. "I told you," he said, his voice quiet but steady as a rock. "I don't lock doors." He rose and put another log on the fire. The flames leaped up, chasing the shadows back, and the room filled with a warm, flickering light. He did not go back to his chair. He took a spare blanket from a chest and laid it on the floor near the hearth, a respectable distance from his own chair. He did not invite her to use it, did not tell her what to do. He simply created a space. She hesitated, then crossed the room and sank down onto the blanket, pulling her knees to her chest. She wrapped the shawl, Anna's shawl, tightly around herself. He returned to his chair. They sat there for the rest of the night, 2 solitary figures sharing the warmth of the same fire, not speaking, just being. The house, for the first time, did not feel haunted, felt watched over. In the shared silence, a foundation of trust, harder and more real than stone, was being laid. The first hint of trouble came not as a rider on the horizon, but as a change in the air. Elias grew quieter, if such a thing were possible. He spent more time watching the long, empty road that led to the ranch, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle that now leaned permanently by the door. She felt it too, a low thrum of anxiety that vibrated just beneath the surface of their routine. The piece they had carefully stitched together with raw thread felt fragile, easily torn. One afternoon, he returned from a rare trip to Jericho Flats for supplies, his jaw set like granite. He unloaded the sacks of flour and salt in silence. His movements were tight, coiled. She was kneading dough at the table, her hands dusted with white. The rhythmic push and fold was a comfort, a familiar meditation. She watched him, waiting. He was in town, Elias said, not looking at her. His back was to her as he stacked tins on the shelf. Brant, asking questions. The dough went slack under her hands. The warmth in the room seemed to recede, chased away by a sudden, biting cold. Brant. The name was a physical blow. The florid face, the slate-chip eyes, the sneering ownership. He says his property was stolen, Elias continued, his voice flat. He turned around then, and his eyes met hers. In them, she saw not pity, but a shared anger, a darkness that matched her own. He's telling folks he's coming to get what's his. She said nothing. Her hands, caked in flour, began to tremble. She pressed them flat on the wooden table to still them. She thought of the bolted door, the wool shawl, the shared silence by the fire, the small, quiet life. It clung to her like a second skin, but a clean one this time, one she had chosen. The idea of Brant's hands on it, on her, was a violation that made her feel ill. He knows where I live, Elias stated. It was not a question. Everyone knew where the widower Elias lived. His isolation was a landmark. The next few days were a taut wire of waiting. The wind howled around the corners of the house, sounding like a mournful cry. Every gust, every skittering sound outside was a potential threat. They moved through their chores, but the rhythm was gone. It was replaced by a shared vigilance. They were two soldiers in a silent siege, watching the battlements of their small, hard-won world. He cleaned his rifle by the firelight each evening, the metallic click and slide of the mechanism a sharp, definitive sound in the quiet house. She found herself sharpening the kitchen knives, drawing the blades over the whetstone until they held a razor's edge. It was a small act of defiance, a preparation for a battle she didn't know how to fight. They came at dusk 3 days later. 3 riders, dark shapes against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. They did not approach with stealth. They rode slowly, deliberately, their arrival an announcement. Elias was on the porch, as if he had been waiting for them. He didn't hold the rifle, but it leaned against the doorframe within easy reach. She watched from the window, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The shawl was wrapped tight around her shoulders. Brant was in the lead, his bulk overflowing the saddle. The 2 men with him were hired muscle, their faces shadowed and grim. They stopped a dozen yards from the porch, the horses stamping and blowing clouds of steam in the cooling air. The confrontation was to take place on this land, this patch of earth she had weeded and walked on, this ground that held his past and her present. Elias, Brant called out, his voice oily with false cordiality. I've come for my property. Elias didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, a solid, unmoving figure. He was part of the house, part of the land. He could not be easily moved. She's not property, he said finally, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. It was calm, but there was an edge to it, like the blade she had just sharpened. Brant laughed, the sound ugly and out of place in the vast quiet. I got a bill of sale says otherwise. The whole town saw you pay for her. You bought her, same as I did. Only difference is, I want her back. I'll even pay you what you gave me. For your trouble, he reached into his coat, as if to produce the coins. She's not for sale, Elias said. Everything's for sale, Elias. You, of all people, should know that Brant's gaze flickered toward the rise where the grave markers stood. A deliberately cruel strike. A muscle jumped in Elias's jaw, but his voice, when he spoke, remained level. You're not welcome on this land. Turn around and ride out. I'm not leaving without what belongs to me, Brant snarled, his cordiality gone. He swung a leg over his saddle, dismounting. I'm taking her. He took a step toward the porch. And in that moment, something inside her broke. Not in a way that shattered her, but in a way that broke open a dam, releasing a force she didn't know she possessed. It was the memory of the rope, the placard, the jeering faces. But it was also the memory of the clean water, the warm bread, the silent companionship by the fire. It was the image of the wildflower on Anna's grave. It was the weight of the shawl on her shoulders. She moved away from the window, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. She walked to the fireplace. The stew pot was simmering on the hearth. It was full and heavy. She grabbed a thick cloth, wrapped it around the hot iron handle, and lifted it. Elias stood his ground on the porch, his hand moving toward the rifle as Brant and his men advanced. He was ready to meet violence with violence. He was ready to defend the quiet life he had let her build inside his own hollow one. Brant was halfway to the steps when the front door swung open. It wasn't Elias who filled the frame. It was her. She stood there, her face pale but her eyes blazing in the dim light. Her hair was wild around her face, and in her hands, she held the pot of scalding stew like a weapon. Brant stopped, his mouth falling open in surprise. He had come for a broken thing, a piece of property. He was not prepared for this. "Get off his land," she said. Her voice was not the whisper he might have remembered. It was low and fierce, honed on the whetstone of her silence. It was the voice of a woman who had found something worth defending. For a heart-stopping second, no one moved. The two hired men looked from her to Brant, their confidence wavering. This was not the simple reclamation they had been paid for. Brant's surprise curdled into rage. "You ungrateful," he started, taking another step forward. She didn't hesitate. With a guttural cry, she swung the pot. She didn't throw it. She let the contents fly. The hot, thick stew arced through the air, a steaming comet of venison and vegetables. It splattered across Brant's chest and face. He screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and pain, stumbling backward, clawing at his face. The two hired men flinched back as if they'd been hit themselves. Elias moved then, a blur of motion. He had the rifle in his hands, not aimed, but held with a clear and deadly promise. He stepped off the porch and stood beside her, a solid wall of protection at her shoulder. They stood together, the widower and the nameless woman, a unified front against the encroaching darkness. "I said," Elias's voice was deadly calm, "get off my land." Brant, howling and cursing, scrambled back toward his horse, his bravado utterly dissolved by the searing, undignified pain of the stew. His men, seeing their employer routed by a woman with a cookpot, wasted no time. They hauled him onto his saddle, and the three of them galloped away into the gathering night, a disorderly and panicked retreat. Their departure was a smear of chaos against the deep peace of the plains. Silence fell, broken only by the whisper of the wind and Brant's fading curses. The empty stew pot lay on its side in the dirt. She stood frozen, the heat of the handle still imprinted on her palm through the cloth. A tremor started in her hands and spread through her whole body. The strength that had surged through her moments before drained away, leaving her weak-kneed. Elias turned to her. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He gently took the cloth from her hand and then reached out, his calloused fingers wrapping around her wrist. It was not a grasp of ownership like the ropes had been. It was a touch of support, steadying. His thumb rested on her pulse, which was racing like a trapped bird. "You were scared," he said. It was a statement of fact, not an accusation. "Yes," she whispered, the single word a massive exhalation of breath. "You didn't run," he said, his eyes holding hers. In his gaze she saw a profound respect. It was a mirror showing her a strength she had never known she possessed. He led her back inside, his hand still a warm, solid presence on her wrist. He guided her to the chair by the fire and pushed her gently into it. He picked up the blanket from the floor and wrapped it around her shaking shoulders. He added more wood to the fire, and the flames roared to life, casting a dancing, golden light over the quiet room. He did not ask if she was all right. He could see that she was not, but he could also see that she would be. He had seen the fire in her eyes, and he knew that fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. That night, the house finally breathed again. In the days that followed the confrontation, a new kind of quiet settled over the ranch. It was not the silence of sorrow or waiting, but of peace. The taut wire of vigilance had been cut. The land felt like their own again, its boundaries sealed not by fences, but by a shared act of defiance. They did not speak of what happened. There was no need. It lived in the space between them, a testament to the bond they had forged in fire and fear. Her presence in the house was no longer tentative. She moved with a new sense of belonging, her footsteps sure on the wooden floors. She had defended this place. She had claimed it as her own. One evening, they sat by the fire, the comfortable silence wrapped around them like a familiar blanket. She was mending one of his shirts, the needle moving with a steady rhythm. He was watching the flames, his face thoughtful in the flickering light. "I need to register a new hand for the winter payroll," he said, his voice casual, yet carrying an unusual weight. "Town clerk needs a name." She stopped sewing, her needle poised in midair. A name. She had gone so long without one that she had almost forgotten she ever had one. The names others had given her, girl, property, thing, had burned away in the heat of her own fury. She was a blank slate. She looked at him, her expression questioning. This was his offer. A name. A place in the world, on paper official. An identity. "I always liked the name Lena," he said quietly, his gaze still on the fire. "It's a good, strong name. Lena." She tried the shape of it in her mind. Felt clean and solid. It was not a name that bent or broke. It was a name a woman who faced down 3 men with a stew pot might have. It was a gift, more precious than the coins he had paid for her freedom. It was the naming of her new self. "Lena," she said aloud. The sound was strange and wonderful in her own ears. "My name is Lena." He turned his head and looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw the winter in his eyes begin to thaw. A faint, slow smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, easing the hard lines of grief etched there. "Lena," he repeated. It was a confirmation, an acceptance. A few weeks later, as the first snows began to dust the high peaks, he rode to a neighboring ranch and returned with a stooped, elderly preacher. Lena stood by the fireplace in a simple dress she had made herself from a bolt of blue calico he had bought. Elias stood beside her, wearing a clean shirt. The ceremony was short, the words plain and direct, spoken before the hearth that had become the heart of their home. There were no guests, no celebration. There was only the quiet solemnity of 2 broken people stitching their lives together, promising shelter, promising loyalty. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Elias took her hand. His grasp was warm and firm, felt like coming home. After the preacher had left, Lena took the tattered dress she had been wearing when she arrived in Jericho Flats, the one she had kept folded in a box beneath her cot. She carried it outside to the fire pit where they burned their rubbish. She held it for a moment, the rough, stained fabric a reminder of the person she had been, the voiceless, humiliated object tied to a post. Then she dropped it into the flames. The fire consumed it greedily, the worn cloth turning to black ash and rising into the cold, clear air. She watched until the last piece of it was gone, a symbolic burning of her old life. She was not that person anymore. She was Lena. She was a wife. She was a survivor. She turned and walked back to the house. Through the window, she could see Elias standing by the fire, waiting for her. The light from the lantern cast a warm, golden glow, pushing back the vast, cold darkness of the plains. She opened the door, and the scent of wood smoke and hot coffee and safety wrapped around her. The house was no longer hollow. It was full. It was a home. They lived their lives on that stretch of hard land. The winters were brutal, the summers hot and dry. But together they weathered it all. They rebuilt the sagging roof of the barn. They planted a new garden that flourished under Lena's patient care. They sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set, rarely speaking, but always understanding. The single grave marker on the hill was no longer a symbol of a sorrow that consumed the present, but a memory that had made space for a new life to grow beside it. Their love was not a thing of grand passion or flowery words. It was a quiet, sturdy thing, built of shared work, mutual respect, and the memory of a stew pot wielded in defiance. It was as real and enduring as the land itself. This story, it isn't just about rescue. It's about the quiet truth that sometimes the most broken things can fit together to make a new kind of whole. It's about the fact that a person isn't property, that a soul can't be bought or sold, only lost and then, if they are very, very lucky, found again. Not by a savior, but by the strength they find in themselves when someone is finally brave enough to stand with them. So here is your naming. Every time you offer a kindness with no expectation of reward, every time you choose to see the person instead of the placard hung around their neck, you are doing the work of Elias. And every time you stand up, find your voice, and refuse to be defined by the ropes that once bound you, you are claiming the fire of Lena. We all have our own private wilderness, our own harsh landscapes to survive. But if you are brave enough to share your fire with another soul shivering in the cold, you might just find that you've built more than a shelter. You might find you've built a home,